All right, because we are short on time, we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone joining us this morning. We are all over the United States. I'm here on the West Coast in Portland. The rest of our panelists are around the US, so we're all in different time zones. But thanks to everyone for joining the Truman National Security Project for this event on the sidelines of the Democratic National Convention. You are joining us for an event called 2 Weeks in November, a post-election scenarios discussion with fabulous fellows and political partners with the Truman National Security Project. We'll be here for about an hour. And we'll do a conversation for about the first 25 minutes. And then for the last part of the conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A for the audience. In order to do that, I would ask that everyone take a look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and use the Q&A function. If you go down there, you can type a question, and I, as well as our moderator and panelists, will see that. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started and pass it over to a fellow with the Truman National Security Project, Rose Jackson, and she'll get us kicked off. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you everyone who is joining us in this wonderful virtual format. To kick this off and just set the scene a bit, as someone personally who has spent years working with civil society and political leaders in other countries to monitor and navigate tense elections in transitional democracies, much of what we're seeing right now in the US is unfortunately hauntingly familiar. We're entering an election period with a president actively seeking to undermine faith in our democratic system, very real possibilities of civic unrest, and the potential for a constitutional standoff over the results of an election. And while this panel will examine the ways in which this election might look different from our usual immediately after November 3rd, much of what can be done to mitigate these worst case scenarios requires us to take action now. We're lucky today to be joined by three exceptional panelists with a breadth of experience covering the ins and outs of mis and disinformation, political campaigning, foreign interference, election administration, constitutional law, and democratic development. To start off, we have Camille Stewart, who is a leading cybersecurity, privacy, and election integrity expert who has led related efforts at the Department of Homeland Security, Deloitte, and Google. She's at the vanguard of efforts to counter mis and disinformation, with particular focus on the impact of disenfranchised communities, as well as efforts to build resilience into US election infrastructure. We also have Alexandra, better known as Xander, Meise, who comes to us from Georgetown University Law Center, where she teaches international human rights law, as well as the Center of Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. At CERL, Xander draws on her over a decade of international and domestic electoral experience to lead research and writing on election security and electoral processes. And finally, we're joined by Josh Berthum, who has over 20 years of experience in digital media and political and corporate communication. In a prior life, he served as an open source intelligence analyst, tracking the risk of violent terrorism. But since the 2016 elections, Josh has dove headfirst into the intricacies of domestic political misinformation and has done so through two entities that he founded and runs, the Swash Labs, which is a full service creative and communication shop in Texas, and Rogue Metrics, a political and digital risk research group. So our hope for this panel is that you do leave appropriately worried, but clear on the very doable and important steps that we can all take to protect our election and our democracy over the course of the next few months. So without further ado, I want to get us to our panelists. And just to give you guys a sense, as Rachel mentioned, we're going to start with a free-flowing conversation here, and then we'll open it up in about 25 minutes or so to questions from all of you. So I just want to get this started. We've got a lot of different things floating around here. And Xander, if I can turn to you to kind of set the table, what is it that looks so different about this election from usual elections? Why is this different? And what should we be looking out for?
Thank you, Rose. And thank you to the Truman National Security Project for inviting me to participate in this great panel today. In so many ways, this election seems similar. We've been watching speeches the last few days as part of the Democratic convention. We'll watch the Republican convention next week. We certainly are getting flyers in the mail and that kind of thing. But we're doing this from our homes in a pandemic and in everything else dumpster fire 2020. And the biggest differences with regard to process that we'll touch upon each and every voter is this idea of voting by mail, which has always happened. Well, I shouldn't say always, but since the Civil War, people have been voting by mail. Our troops did it back then. But the scale on which that's about to take place is unprecedented. And related to that is this idea, which Americans are not accustomed to, of not necessarily having an answer on election day or election night as to who the winner is. We have encountered this, for instance, in 2000 with Bush versus Gore. We've seen, into the wee hours of the morning, election results come in sometimes. But this idea that a count of mail-in votes may take a while makes this election a lot more like, frankly, most elections around the world, where there is a election period and a counting period. And that adjustment for us to understand that it may take time, I think, is a huge shift, because it's a mindset shift for us. And just some statistics also to just draw upon the fact of the importance of the scale of the mail-in ballot situation. Between 1996 and 2016, according to Pew Research, the use of vote by mail went from 7.8% to 21%. So already you see a threefold increase there. Now we're expecting, you contrast 2016 to now, we might see in some areas a 50% use of vote by mail, depending, right? There's going to be adjustments depending on where people are. But think of the thousands and thousands of extra votes that entails, the extra ballots that need to be printed, the extra workers that then need to be involved in the counting and processing, right? And you can go down the line. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Luckily, we've had the primaries to give us some time to figure this out and to give us some time to plan for that. And that's some of what we're going to talk about today. But again, problems that may have been small when it was a small number of people with vote by mail. And by the way, vote by mail, absentee is vote by mail, just to be clear, okay? This is all voting by mail. So when you hear people distinguish between those two things, if it goes in an envelope in the mail, this is vote by mail. In the primary in Wisconsin, we saw 23,000 ballots rejected for some administrative issue, failure to sign, some other box not checked, something like this. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost that state by approximately 30,000 votes, right? So these numbers matter. The scale and the difference matters. And so that is certainly one of the things that is a biggest difference between now and then. And as Josh and Camille can talk about too, we have the proliferation of disinformation even more than we saw in 2016.
Thank you. And I do want to pass to Camille to pick up a bit on the conversation around mis and disinformation in this environment, but just to add and stress what Xander just said, that the addition of these new changes means that it's also a longer and tougher process, even without anyone trying to mess with it, to shift large parts of the country into a system of voting that requires hand counting in some places and different rules state by state, which I think is a great way to segue into a conversation around mis and disinformation. So Camille, can you give us a little insight into how that plays in, the uncertainty around the action of carrying out an election itself and all of these changes? What does that mean for the country as a whole? But what does that mean in particular for communities that have been targets of voter suppression historically?
Yeah, thanks for having me. To start, there are a lot of open questions around even the things that Xander was just talking about. How do we deal with mail-in ballots that don't have postmarks? States are grappling with these questions right now. And so those open questions that we have leaders looking at, which is great, means that there's a lot of room for misinterpretation, for taking information that you hear from one state and applying it to your state incorrectly. And we're seeing a lot of, fake political scientists. Everyone has become one. Your neighbor, your mom, your cousin, sharing IG memes and Facebook posts and other, WhatsApp messages that communicate some information about how, when, where you vote, how you can take your ballot to the polls, which is not correct, taking it to an election official. You have to look at your state's rules for how you submit your ballot if you decide to not mail it in, if you decide to hand deliver it or submit it otherwise. So what's concerning is there's a lot of information free floating around that is coming from trusted sources, from your family members, from your friends, etc. We're also seeing a lot of information operations, disinformation, misinformation, just kind of sowing confusion and discord. We saw the DC blackout hashtag that had folks thinking that the Washington Monument was on fire and people scared that, DC was under attack, and people looking out their windows and seeing nothing, and folks across the nation being confused and scared. So we all need to be ready and willing to be critical of the information that's coming to us and fact check, fact check, fact check. It is on you to consume the information you hear, all the well-meaning information and otherwise, and make sure that's actually how it applies to your state and to how you plan to vote. But on top of that, we have always seen that the narratives of the disenfranchised are ripe for manipulation. In 2016, we saw Black Americans acutely targeted, but we also saw veterans, et cetera. And in the middle of a Black Lives Matter movement where folks are asking for and demanding racial justice, we are in a moment where that narrative can be manipulated to further polarize both sides of our nation, right? The far left and the far right, but also to further suppress the votes of these disenfranchised communities, Black Americans, immigrants, et cetera. Distrust in our systems is only exacerbated by the confusion and calls people to not participate in a system that's not built for them. And so what we want to avoid is folks listening to this manipulation of narratives and deciding not to participate in the process. On top of that, these changes in how voting happens are particularly targeted at low income and minority communities. And folks will continue to disengage. Will they stand in line for hours on end, maybe into the next morning? As Michelle Obama said in her speech, we all need to bring a snack, bring a dinner, and stand in line if you choose to vote in person. But what is really important is, as Xander pointed out, 23,000 votes could make the difference in a state. And so everyone needs to engage in this process and be stewards of the information that they're consuming, because misinformation and disinformation will come from all angles. And as we saw in the DC blackout hashtag, the perpetrators of that information operation actually sent information on both sides. So they were saying there's a fire, they were saying there was all this chaos and confusion, but then they were also saying, who's saying that? That's confusing, that's not true, why is that happening? And so the goal is confusion. The goal is to make you so distrustful of the system that you disengage from it. And so narratives can come from all sides. So take an active role in being a steward of the information you consume.
And if I may, because again, this is new for so many people, this is when people are so thirsty for info, they are more likely to be susceptible to that false info from their aunt, from their friend, from some trusted source that they've seen. So to educate people and to check your facts, as Camille said, I think is so important.
Absolutely. And just to pick up something that both of you have touched on there as we move to talk about this a bit more with Josh, it's not that every piece of incorrect information is intentionally incorrect, or that the people sharing it intend to create distrust, but both can be equally harmful. And so whether we're talking about foreign disinformation that's trying to feed into these systems of confusion, active domestic disinformation that's trying to create confusion or change a political outcome, or frankly, just the confusion that exists within all of these changing narratives, they all combine to be equally dangerous. One thing that we haven't spoken about yet at great length is the role of campaigns and the political architecture itself in engaging with this. And Josh, you've been doing a lot of work looking specifically at domestic dis and misinformation, as well as how campaigns are playing into these moments. And just to call out a number of pieces that you've written, I think if folks search, they'll be able to find that, or we can send that out afterwards, focusing on some of these very questions about how the differences in this election and this electoral environment will come together for November 3rd. Could you talk to us a bit about how campaigns are grappling with this new environment that they're confronting, for better or for worse, and what it's going to look like for them the night of the election and in the weeks following in ways that they may not be accustomed to?
Sure. Hi from Texas, and thanks to the Truman National Security Project for having me on today. to be on a really great panel. The thing with campaigns and the struggle that campaigns have always had, as technology has changed, as communications have changed, as methods have changed, is always the struggle to live in the environment as it actually is, as opposed to how you wish it would be, or to fight the battle, fight the last battle and imagine that is preparation for the next battle. All of these are new and weird problems, and in part because I think there is a definitional challenge when it comes to talking about, say, for instance, disinformation that was part of the foreign intelligence op in the 2016 election. The way that was reported, and the way that the media talked about it, and the way that campaigns synthesized that information and learned it as a lesson, was that bots are bad and Russia's hacking everything. And a real actual risk that has definitely evolved and materialized in the United States since then is the adoption of techniques and methods which are cheap and do not require a ton of technological skill, and just sort of methods for communicating disinformation, contributing to chaos, sowing a lot of confusion in an effort to not just create confusion, as Camille pointed out, but also as an active element of a voter suppression plan. The goal of propaganda and disinformation is very often voter suppression, or it's to drive people to reality apathy and to get them to disengage from the civic process. So when campaigns are dealing with this, a lot of times they are, whether they're dealing with everyone as a political scientist now, or they are trying to learn from the last lesson. Many will, say, respond to getting pulled into a disinformation campaign by directly controverting whatever has been said, which doesn't really work because the intended audience for this is not someone who's ready to listen to a nuanced factual argument. So when you say that's not true, and I'll tell you how it's not true, when they have not invested in the hard work of building a resilient audience, or restructuring or rethinking how they communicate in a way so that they've got clear, transparent narratives about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and about what's happening in objective reality, all of that stuff tends to be very effective against campaigns. I will say that campaigns are better about general digital risk than they used to be. It's a lot more common to find campaigns that are thinking about strong password policies, or how they share information, or not just letting anybody into their file share. They're thinking about the stuff that ended up being the low-hanging fruit in 2016, whereas I think it's harder to fish a campaign now than it used to be, which is good because that stuff gets pulled into hack and leak and disinformation and stuff like that. But largely, because this problem is so new and it is so weird, I think that campaigns are still sort of not prepared for it. And I think the biggest evidence of that on the Democratic side was during the Iowa caucuses, when for just a couple of hours, we didn't know what the clear outcome of an election was, and Republicans not having any clear dog in that fight, they injected a ton of disinformation. They amplified a lot of stuff that wasn't true or wasn't even relevant, but they filled a vacuum. And every successful propaganda campaign, not even back to Stalinism, but to the Roman era, is, every available space will be filled up with disinformation in an effort to create that confusion, in an effort to create that chaos. And when you combine a campaign that doesn't quite know what to do, or hasn't really worked on or thought about the problem because there's a million other things to do in a campaign and everything is very hard, when you combine that with a media apparatus that's not ready to run an election night and not know who the clear winner is, it creates a ton of opportunity for confusion and for people to be sort of drawn into panic or disinformation or a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening right outside their window.
Thank you. So that's a great segue to when I told friends that I was doing this panel, what they referred to as the "will you be telling us when we need to go hide in the mountains" section, which I say as a joke, except there are some really serious concerns about the potential for civic unrest, many of which come from worries about how much longer it will take to count ballots, how different November 3rd onward will look. And as Xander, you have stated it's an election period, an accounting period, and not an election day. So with that in mind, at the risk of asking you all to speculate terribly and wildly, I want to turn it over to speak a little bit about where you see those risks. As I lose, can you guys still hear me? Excellent. Where you see those risks or push factors leading into the potential for civic unrest or conflict. And Josh, just picking up on the Iowa example, if there are things we can take away from these little experiences we've had in the primaries to help learn better paths to avoid some of these more frightening situations. I'll start with you, Xander, if you're happy to take that terrifying question I put before you.
Sure, and I'm going to be extra gloom and doom when I say the following. So having done international election support and observation, I will say in that, wearing that hat, we often talk about what are the triggers of election violence, things like this. And as a report that was from the Joint Task Force of the European Commission and UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, they did a program on electoral violence, and they noted that there are a few enabling conditions or triggers for it. And this may sound familiar: impunity, inequitable distribution of resources, societal divides, high unemployment, high stakes in gaining and losing power, weak rule of law, and availability of weapons. So that list, which was created by participants who had experienced election violence, not in the United States, I think we can all say that there are certainly some, if not all of those items on that list that we can argue are here and present and ripe in the United States. But as far as specific triggers, I think to Josh's point, the uncertainty. We are not used to uncertainty here. And we've actually always had it, because there's always been a gap between when you hear, oh, we're calling an election versus the results are certified. But we've had the luxury here of often not having to pay attention to that certification piece. We'll occasionally hear about a race that gets decided by a card flip or a coin toss, but that there is an official period. And if you look in the election laws, and election laws differ by state, right? There is a provision that'll say you have to certify your results by. So there already is built into our system right now, and has been for a while, a period. We just haven't been aware of it. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help prevent conflicts or disruption is to help, and Josh mentioned the media, help educate the public that this is the case. It's about expectation management. Let's be clear right now. Expect that we will not have an answer. Expect that it will take some time. And I see, if I dare do this, address one of the questions that's been raised in the Q&A. There was talk about how to best administer counting to make sure the process is transparent and reliable. I would say before we get to counting, we need to have education on the fact there is counting. You know what would be wonderful and would warm my heart is to see a news report where someone actually goes to a board of elections and walks through, okay, what happens when your ballot comes in, and show the public, have that transparency. Make people have confidence, see a face of, oh, that person is going to count my ballot, and that sort of thing, because managing the expectation, I think, is going to be so important for trying to mitigate potential disruption.
Thank you so much for that. Josh or Camille? Camille, do you want to take this fun question next?
Sure. And I just want to add to Xander's point, there are a lot of locales that already allow you to come in and see how they handle their voting procedures. But people just don't know this information. And I think that lack of clarity and that lack of narrative around the fact that this election will look different and results will be delayed is problematic. And it is a symptom of the broader problem that Josh introduced, and is really important. That need to fill the information vacuum is going to come both from malicious actors and the folks we trust, institutions that should be able to provide us with factual information. So what we saw in the Iowa caucus was a lot of people speculating on what happened with that app and why we couldn't get results and all of those things. And those are opportunities for confusion, as Josh mentioned, but also to get us to a point where people are not going to pay attention to what actually happens at the end, right? You're already so distrustful and disengaged from the system that you are unwilling to listen to what actually happens later, and the damage is already done. So we need our media to be stewards of reporting how and when and why things are happening, and only doing that when they actually have information. This is what is happening in this moment. I won't speculate about whether it was some kind of cyber attack or some kind of information operation, but this is what we know now. That'll be really important. And as we sit in the middle of a Black Lives Matter movement, we are going to see it become a tool for election night confusion, right? People will blame any kind of potential violence, as Xander was explaining the potential for violence, on that movement, thus pulling a demographic, a group that is trying to peacefully demand racial justice into the narratives and politicizing a movement in a way that will further enhance the distrust, the disenfranchisement, and pull folks out of our political process because they will be so angry and further, polarized. And so we should recognize that leveraging these narratives makes them both a target, right, to pull them from the system, but also a tool to further polarize our discourse and incite the left and the right to pit against each other on another topic, on a topic that should at a base level not have anything political about it. So what we can expect is leveraging ongoing movements to fuel violence, falsely or correctly. And what is scary about that is that it will erupt in a blaze because this is already a highly emotional topic. And folks who are engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement are fighting for their lives in a sense, right? They're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for a place in society. And if that is pulled into the narratives around the election, and especially any kind of violence, we will see all of the things that Xander talked about amplified times 10.
And we have an opportunity and a risk here that is presented by the intersection of unrest that already exists. So to Camille's point, right, we already have seen, we have peaceful protests, for example, but then we have reports that explain that there are malicious actors who have taken advantage of a peaceful protest just to cause chaos or to cause destruction. We see in the spread of disinformation with regard to the pandemic, for example, an intersection between false information about a disease and white nationalism. And we see conflict around that, right? So we have little fires already burning here that could potentially join and become a very big one. And how do we do that? Well, we can create fire lines, right? When there's a wildfire, they sometimes dig a trench to try and separate the fires. Let's do that. And how do we do that? Knowledge is power. So the more that we can educate people on, what is going on, what to expect, by the way, someone may try and do X, Y, and Z or say that. Well, if people are warned, then they might be more suspicious when they then see that meme or they hear that report that is false. But yes, the intersection of potential triggers for conflict right now are very high.
And I hate to put the mantle of imagining Trump's reactions to things on Josh's plate here. But it is striking to me that in everything we're discussing, we're talking about plenty of things that happen absent a pretty intentioned and directly motivated individual who has shown his hand a number of times in a propensity to question an election, threaten and attempt to mobilize violence, et cetera. Josh, could you give us a little insight into both the ways in which you think Trump might engage with this uncertain election period, exacerbate it, use it, and on the other side of that, what that means for our political actors and candidates? I'm just going to tag in a question that one of our viewers here has already sent in, which is an interesting one, but one I think we've all thought about. What role do various parts of this ecosystem have if a candidate preemptively declares themselves the winner while counting is still going. So in those scenarios, if you could shed some light on the after count.
So there's a number of things that I think present themselves as risks therein. I cannot underscore with possibly any more urgency what Xander and Camille just talked about in terms of the role of the media and the role of public education in managing expectations about how election night is going to go. And that is for a number of very mechanical, sort of boring reasons that could get unboring real quick. Number one is that, to Xander's point about when the time lag between when an election is called and when the results are certified, when an election is called is normally sort of a data-driven operation inside of a news organization. When results are certified is a political process. And let's assume for a second that many secretaries of state that are responsible for certifying the results of the election in their states, county executives, election officials, the vast majority of those are political offices, partisan offices. And what we have learned in the last couple of years is that every time the Trump administration has the opportunity to make a decision, they make the worst one possible. And the lengths to which state officials will go, which county, which local officials will go to express loyalty, to show fealty, to be on the right team and do stuff, whether it contravenes their oath of office or whether it goes against the spirit of what it is they're supposed to be doing, they always take that opportunity. And certainly there have been exceptions here and there, but the vast majority of the time, if someone has an opportunity to do something to further the cause of their team, they will take it. So the media's role as an arbiter of declaring final results is going to be more important than ever, because the political pressure on local officials to preemptively say, oh, well, this is decided already before, say, all the mail-in ballots have been called, is going to be enormous. And the nice thing about this for the press is that it is a fundamentally nonpartisan, entirely data-based informational thing that they can do. In order to say, like, we are not going to call the results of this. We know there are this many mail-in ballots out. They can talk about the process. And this is the thing that was missing in reporting about Iowa, but that surprisingly we got a lot of from Tim Russert in 2000, when they didn't have big data screens and it was just Tim with a whiteboard talking about, like, here's this county and there's this many votes here, and the way that the count happens in this county is this. And I remember, like, I stayed up all night watching that, but it was never like there was that initial call that it was over, and then they retracted it, and then sort of the goal of the news organizations at that moment became, let's explain what's happening. And if we start from there, weeks out from the election, and news organizations say this is how the count is going to go, MSNBC is doing a thing right now where they have built a website where you can go and learn about what the voting process and requesting vote by mail is like in your state. And they have a little ad about it where your favorite anchors are at home and they're like, hey, it's voting season instead of election day. And, like, it's a little corny, but it's absolutely the right thing to be doing, because it is a public education thing. Like, they're not making money off that. It's just, hey, come here and learn how you can vote. Every news organization should do that. There are certainly serious journalists at Fox News that could be a linchpin for governing how information about the election is communicated on election night and in the weeks after. You know, Chris Wallace could really govern the opinions and the reactions of a huge audience about what's happening by just keeping it real and saying, we don't know what this result is yet. Here's the process. We're going to talk about the process all the way through it. As far as the Trump administration goes, in terms of what they will do, you know, I didn't expect the post office to be the last guardrail against fascism. I didn't expect we would find ourselves in a place where we were fighting to defend the post office. And I think that in an environment in which the government, when disinformation from official sources has been actively damaging and dangerous to huge numbers of Americans, and the ability of Americans to trust in information their government gives them about really vital things like a public health emergency is at an all-time low, they have shown over and over again in the last 6 months that they do not care about that at all. And everything from how they have communicated about a really critical public health emergency to deploying federal agents and the military against peaceful protesters means that the possibility for flashpoints are there, and they have run a lot of beta tests for how they would do that and get away with it in a space of time where they could not be effectively challenged, especially because other things are going on. So the role of the media is super important. If there's one thing that anybody listening to this could take away from it, it would be at the local level. Your local daily newspaper could go in and talk to election officials and just talk about, here's how it's going to go. Your local TV news channel could talk to your biggest counties and say, here's what we expect to see. They're not going to have a huge role to play the same way that 24-hour cable news or the national nets are going to have on election night. But there's no cost outside of their normal operation stuff in order to do that. It is fundamentally nonpartisan, and it is really important, I think, to the future of the republic for them to talk about this process and describe it in a way so that people are educated, so that there's not really going to be a more effective way to neutralize or defang disinformation that tries to fill up all those spaces, because you will have erased those spaces ahead of time. You will have mitigated a ton of that uncertainty and set the expectation for how things are going to go, so that if somebody shows up and says, I'm going to go ahead and declare that I win, even though all the votes haven't been counted, you have a resilient audience that has been told that this is how the count is going to go and this is when it's going to happen. And that message will be far less effective than if it happens in a vacuum where people aren't prepared with knowledge that would undercut that statement.
So if I may, Josh, just disagree with you on one point,
Sure.
Or at least add to it, which is that, yes, I as much as I too have been saying media, public education, what have you, let's be clear, politics are local, and this can start with you. People have been asking what are specific things that people can do. Don't wait for the media to educate you. Don't wait for your local politicians to say something, right? You as an individual can educate yourself. And if you're looking for a nonpartisan place to go, I highly recommend vote.org. It has information on all the states. You can look up what the rules are in your state, because again, despite what maybe you hear some national politicians say, voting rules are local. It is local entities that actually implement these rules, that enforce these rules. It is the local courts in first instance that deal with, this is an issue that is very, very local.
And to not only agree with you, but to talk about something that's backed up by science, people have shown, or studies have shown, that the most effective way to overcome disinformation is conversations with trusted loved ones.
Yeah. So that is just number one, what you can do. And people ask also about what efforts are underway. Again, a lot of these are local, but they can be statewide or helpful. I mean, I can say here in Pennsylvania, and while we speak about Pennsylvania post office, I will say that's a Benjamin Franklin bobblehead, first postmaster general of the United States right there, University of Pennsylvania, shout out. But anyway, here in Pennsylvania, the Democratic Party for months has been doing a public education campaign on vote by mail, because they have been planning since last year to, they had made changes to make vote by mail more accessible, and they have been doing a great education on that. But that may be what's happening here. That may not be happening where you are. So educate yourself, educate your neighbors, ask people where they're going to vote, that kind of thing. That can really, really matter. Thank you.
And just to lift that up, the rules are still changing in a lot of states. So if you've checked a month ago, check again. Keep checking and submitting requests early, doing everything you can to make sure you are not the burden for election officials to process. Means that for people that are later into the process or have a harder time in gaining access to the ballot, you are not an impediment to their access. Xander, I want to ask one question of you, and then cognizant of time, we have about 20 minutes left. We'll be turning to some additional questions from the audience. We have been seeing those come in and trying to weave them in a bit. But Xander, just a quick and very difficult question is if you can walk us through, if we are in a scenario after the election where we don't have results, we're a week or two out, there's perhaps growing protests on the streets, Trump has deployed a very unclear mishmash of federal law enforcement of certain varieties to confront those protests. It's rapidly turning into some of the situations that you guys have been discussing here. How does this all come to ground? If there's a disputed count or disputed sense of who has won the election, what are the steps that we take and how do we get to a final answer? Knowing that there may be 3 or 4 answers there, if you can help us understand the path.
Sure. So first of all, I think we, and this is generally understood at this point, we can fully expect that there will be some fights in the courts in some of these elections, whether it will be in the presidential or local, you're going to see some disputes. We saw this with regard to the primaries, for instance, with regard to Wisconsin. There was a challenge to changes to the voting rules, and could those be implemented? And it did get fast-tracked up to the Supreme Court and back down. But to be clear, again, voting rules are state laws. And what the court is going to do is the court's not going to say that Sally beat Bob, right, in an election. That's not what the court does. The court is going to talk about, well, this law as written like this, can be interpreted as, right? That's different. So they're saying this is what it means, or if it violates, for instance, the constitutional right to voter enfranchisement, that kind of thing. But they're going to be dealing with procedure. And let me tell you, the courts do not like to get involved in elections. They don't. They don't. So to the extent that they make rulings, it's going to be very narrow. And we see this where in the Wisconsin decision too, there was a deferral to the states. Okay, the state legislature made a change. Okay, if a lower court tries to make a change to voting rules, then well, that's probably going to get undone by the upper courts, right? So that's just something to keep in mind, that even if there are court cases, the court is not actually going to say this person wins, because that still is a responsibility that falls upon the election officials who certify the election. The court can talk about process, okay? So, and all of that said, again, one of the things that I know I have had to come to realize in 2020, as uncomfortable as it is for a lawyer and someone who literally carries around a copy of the Constitution all the time, is that I may love this, but at the end of the day, this may not save us. What will is the faith in the system, because all of the words on paper only mean so much if we don't believe them. So again, as much as there may be a court battle or court battles about this, it's going to come back again to us believing and trusting in the system. As for final results, if there was one point I wanted to make today to make clear, there was a myth I wanted to dispel, because I've seen running around rumors, for instance, that if we don't have a result by January, that Nancy Pelosi becomes the president. Let me be clear, the answer to that is no, because people are thinking line of secession. There are a couple of at least clear milestone points in the presidential election that are dictated by law. So first of all, Congress sets the date of the election, is November 3rd. So there has been a lot of talk how it can't just be delayed by presidential fiat or something else. It would be Congress has to change it. As far as election results concerned, the law states that the states must choose their electors, because we're still electoral college, right, by the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. So what does that mean this year? December 14th. That's when we're supposed to have the choosing of electors. Now, if something does go wrong in this process, okay, the term of the president by law ends on January 20th at noon. Full stop. We also have, if there's an issue with the congressional elections, that congressional term also ends in January, right? And a new Congress is supposed to take effect in early January. So there, if all of the election results are up in the air, we have the House in question, and in the Senate, there are, not everyone's up for re-election, but some people are, and there would be 65 senators remaining. So if it were to actually get to go down, it gets very complicated very fast. While the Senate is a majority Republican, as far as the ones who are not running for re-election, it's currently a majority Democrat. Could the presidency go to the president pro tem? Perhaps, but as I said, I just wanted to dispel that rumor right now. It's not quite that simple. Nancy Pelosi will not become president. But there are, as I said, many gates along the way, that there are at least certain deadlines that must be met. And if we look back to what happened in the 2000 election, when the Supreme Court made its ruling, it was just before this time frame of the states certifying their electors. So I think that timing-wise, we can expect that even if this election period goes through the month of November, and I think, Josh, one of your recent pieces that you wrote talked about campaigns being ready to go through December because of the extended counting period. You know, I think that we will see that there is pressure to get a more definitive result by that December 14th deadline for electors.
We thank you so much for that. And I realize it's the million scenarios that we can't possibly play out. Someone had asked here, what happens if the votes are not counted by that point in time? Is it fair to say that we're in pretty murky legal and precedential territory at that point?
Yes, because, you know, there are a lot of things that we can say, and, you know, you can hear people, for instance, point to laws that, oh, well, the rules say or the law says. But to be clear, a lot of these rules have not been tested. And a lot of the state level rules are new. There is a lot of new law out there with regard to elections. And a lot has changed since 2010 and then since 2016. And so even if you see a talking head, a box like us now or a box on TV telling you, well, this is what's going to happen, we have to actually see it play out. We have to see some of these rules and laws be tested. So, you know, no one is, if anyone gives you a 100% answer, don't trust them. We can make a prediction, but we don't necessarily have a guarantee. And we can say certain things are likely, but what has been likely in 2020, really?
Recall the murder hornets. I want to turn to some of the questions from the audience. We just got an interesting one in from Sarah Knight. Recent scenario planning exercises have suggested that mass popular mobilization may be key to making sure elections aren't called prematurely before votes are properly counted, and to ensure everyone sits tight and lets that counting happen. I suspect these mobilizations will occur naturally and that there will be overlap with folks who have been demanding justice for Black lives. What are the most important things beyond the media and communications trainings that would be important to have in place to ensure those mobilizations are successful and peaceful? And Camille, since you brought this up at the beginning of our conversation, I'd like to turn to you.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be learned from the Black Lives Matter movement about educating, spreading information throughout the ranks of folks who want to get engaged, and clarity of mission. And so in the event that there is a mobilization around holding election officials accountable at local levels to ensure that we get proper outcomes, it will be important for folks in each location to understand what the voting procedures are in their state and their local county, to have clear means of communication. If any of you posted the blackout image during the blackout day and use the Black Lives Matter hashtag, you probably saw people asking you to take that down, because that hashtag is a means of communication for activists and folks who are actively engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so understanding how information will need to move through such a movement so that it can be tailored to the local environment but connected to a larger national narrative will be really important, as well as making sure that the folks leading those movements at a local level and everyone that they engage with has authoritative information about how the process should work, so that they can make clear demands of their election officials to hold them accountable to the rules as they are written. And so it is imperative for all of us to understand what an election that is run properly in our locale looks like, so that we can engage in such a movement. Also, correct your friends. If you see them sending that weird meme that we were talking about, or some slightly false information, as Josh mentioned, a conversation is the best way for somebody to actually internalize new information. So engage with your friend in a dialogue. Don't just not share that meme. Actively engage in an active discussion to help them understand why it's wrong, what the truth is, because that individual understanding, that individual sharing of knowledge is how we get a more informed public.
And I'd like to add to that and say, like, I know that we are all tired and we are exhausted, but not just correct your friends, but if you are following a campaign and you see them spreading disinformation and they're on your side, yell at them about it. If you see local news sources reporting things that are wrong, that you have properly interrogated and you understand is either fear-based disinformation or somebody just got it wrong, let them know. Right? Part of participating in a resilient audience and strengthening the audience around you is really demanding clarity and surety from the places you get your information. The number one, like when I have talked to campaigns about disinformation, worrying about it coming from domestic sources, and I'm in a partisan group, the thing I open and close with is, and don't you do this too. The truth, either it matters or it doesn't. And if we're going to be honest brokers of objective reality, we have to demand that of the people we're supporting as well.
Absolutely. So we're getting a lot of questions also just about like the tactical confusions and logistical difficulties of all of these changes and how people are voting. Just suffice to say, we got a question about early in-person voting, questions about poll watchers and the availability of polling locations. Just to reiterate, I think from the entire panel, this is assuming every possible attempt at both foreclosing the ability for people to vote easily and taking advantage of confusion around how people can vote is an active play and will be implemented. And people should be fighting back against it locally in all the ways that we've been talking about. We're focusing a bit on the questions of what do we do assuming the consequences of those things coming. But I hope what is coming across in all of these answers is that the thing you can do to prevent the worst later is to focus on those things now, to get the information out now, to demand that the US Postal Service has funding and can operate, to get answers from your local elections officials about where people can hand in ballots if not, to make sure your friends and family are registered, have requested their absentee ballots if they're eligible, to help your own communities to navigate this in a very personal way. I just want to say that because I see so many of these questions and they're the right questions. So it's not to be dismissive so much as just the acknowledgement that that is the reality we are all working in at this moment. If any of the panelists want to address some of those specifically, there have also been a lot of questions about whether there are programs that you're aware of to educate the media or the public about these issues, or other things that you'd like to highlight or elevate that people can go to for resources or actions to confront this themselves.
I see that there's a question about early voting. So just a couple things on that. Early voting, it's another one of these terms that gets thrown around and it depends what the definition is. There are some jurisdictions, not everywhere, that permit you to, for instance, on the 2 weekends before an election, come in person, use a voting machine and vote before election day. There's that concept of early voting, so the voting period. But even if your state does not have that, that doesn't mean you can't vote early in the sense of get your mail-in ballot, ask for it right now, have that mail-in ballot in hand, and your board of elections will have instructions as to how you can turn it in person if you want, right? So there you go. You can go and you can vote early in that sense. Having handed it over, don't worry about the post office, but not your polling station like some of the memes are telling you, or the internet, but like your board of elections, there are instructions for that. And again, vote.org is a great place to start to find out what your rules are. As far as what can be done to prevent or closure of voting centers, this is a hot mess. So yes, there are going to be lawyers who are fighting this for you on one side, but that's not going to necessarily fix it. What you can do, again, old-fashioned politics, this is about calling your local officials, because who determines what centers are open? That's a local problem. Funding is going to have a lot to do with this. Also, COVID, of course, we have to have precautions for it. But one way that you can help have your polling places not closed, volunteer to be a poll worker. This is huge. I did this for 10 years. Let me tell you, there is like the joy in seeing pure democracy in action. Maybe it's just me, but like this is amazing. It really is a way you can give back to your community. And some jurisdictions had to close polling centers during the primary because they just didn't have enough workers. So please consider, if you're able to take the time off to do it from work, to take a day, please register now. I know that the Biden-Harris campaign has offered links to figure out how to register, but you can always you can always look at your board of elections. Will have information as to how to register to be a poll worker. And basically everywhere is looking for this right now. That is a nonpartisan position that you can take to have a direct influence on the election, right? Because if more poll workers means they can have more polling places. Also, you're that contact with a voter as to their experience when they check in, are they having a provisional ballot, that kind of thing. That's very one-on-one. You can also be a poll watcher, right, an observer, but then you're just observing and not participating. And that's another really important thing. People have asked about counts. How do we certainly worry about, misinformation of, oh, everyone's going to claim that the count is bad. Rose has also served as an international election observer, I understand. And what she and I can tell you is that, this is the kind of thing that you do, right? You watch. If you have witnesses, it's a lot harder to have tampering. So let's make sure that there is at every precinct in the US, wouldn't it be wonderful if there were some observer there to watch what the officials are doing? Because it's a lot harder to do things when there's sunlight shining on it. So those are a few concrete things I would add. And if you are a lawyer, I would encourage you or a law student to sign up for a training on protest, being a lawyer observer to a protest. The National Lawyers Guild has these, but there are actually legal observers to protests. And there's a training for that. And these people observe protests, help report irregularities when they occur, and then get that information to the people who need to have it to be able to help the protesters with their legal cases if they're arrested or that kind of thing. But we talk about future and unrest. This is a great thing to get trained on now, so you're ready for later if you want to help in that way.
It's worth adding in that most of the state parties, particularly in states that have a really serious history of voter suppression, in which all of these attempts at voter suppression are just additive, are running pretty robust voter protection efforts that you can volunteer for even if you're not a lawyer. Yes. Georgia just got a big one set up, and I believe we have a fellow Truman member who is helping to run that effort. And so find your local party, find your state of choice, and jump in and lend a hand. I want to
exactly. You don't need to be a lawyer to be a poll worker or an observer. Let me make clear.
I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of this, so just wanted to do a quick recap of some of the main points that our panelists have raised up, and then turn it over to these three to close it out for us. So three things that really have seemed to come out through the course of this conversation is, number one, that we shouldn't expect our results from the election to be finalized the night of the election, but we should equally not perceive that to be scandal in and of itself. And normalizing acceptance of that reality now is perhaps one of the single greatest things that can be done to build some resiliency during a really tense time. Number two, that undermining confidence in the results and in the system is as much a goal of some of the most pernicious actors we see as undermining or affecting the results itself. So keeping that in mind as the goal, it's not necessarily just winning so much as making sure no one can win. And the third, that there are no bright red lines, that institutions themselves, as I think Xander helpfully laid out, it's a lot of norms and it's a lot of untested rules. So we really do need to ask these questions and everybody be involved in the act of protecting our election. So with those three summaries, I do want to pass it to our three panelists. Perhaps we'll start with Josh and go from there. And I just got a note that we do have a little extra time if people want to stay on past noon.
Yeah, I just think that, people like to talk about, well, people don't like to talk about it, but society is a thin veneer, right? A lot of how the world works is based on sort of a shared and agreed upon reality. And I think what has been most disruptive for people in the last 4 years or the last 6 months or however you want to look at it, is that the rules that we all sort of assumed were in place, the norms that we all sort of thought would act as firewalls against, oh, well, it won't get this bad because X will happen or Y will kick in and it'll be fine. We've been shown over and over again that that's just not the case anymore. So this is not to say that you absolutely have to expect the ultimate worst case scenarios in every single thing, but I think it is worth it to candidly and objectively try and understand how things are where you are, whether it's from a voting process standpoint or from a public health standpoint or from a standpoint where, now it's time to get out in the streets and make an argument for what it is that we want to do. We know that Donald Trump lies to the American people every single day, but he is always honest about what he wants to do and all the awful stuff he is planning on. So we have to, the main problem that we have had as a country is our shared inability to believe him. So we need to believe that all of that is possible. And I think that as we're looking at what is coming, campaigns can do a big service now that so much voter contact is going to have to be digital anyways, or an alternative to how it used to be. Campaigns are always starved for content. Load up on how voting works. Load up on how early vote works. Load up on demystifying some of this stuff. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, and just, I think that the most comforting thing to me is that, yes, you know, the Trump administration tells you all the time the bad stuff they're going to do, and then they do it. But pushback works. People being in the streets works. We've seen that in the incredible organizing, the incredible message discipline, the incredible effectiveness of the Black Lives Matter protests, and just all of the huge, long overdue strides for social justice and police reform that have just begun. There's still so much work to do, but that's been really effective. And I think that infrastructure, in the end, and the example that has been set there, may go a long way towards being what saves us. And I take comfort in that and feel good about it.
Thank you so much. Xander, would you like to give us your closing thoughts?
Well, let's do Camille first, because I recognize I've talked a lot, and I will go after that. So Camille.
Reserving the end spot.
No problem. So I think the biggest thing that I want you all to take away, and that this whole conversation should underscore, is vote, right? Like, your vote matters. It is important. Rebuff any effort to stop you from said voting, because at the core of it, your local elections, this national election, state elections, all of those elections are extremely important to reversing the tide of what has happened, right? That is how you get local election officials who will uphold the letter of the law around how voting procedures will work. That is how you get a national leadership that you are supportive of and believe in. So please go vote. That is the biggest thing that this conversation should underscore for you. Be critical of the information that you consume, and be critical of the information that the people that you care about, the campaigns you care about, really just anybody is putting out there, and rebuff things that are inaccurate, right? Like, the clarity of information, well-sourced, reliable information is going to be the hallmark of a functioning system, and alleviating some of the distrust and confusion that's happening. Get involved, become a poll worker, get out and help your neighbor get to the polls if they can't take themselves. Remind people to get their ballots early, get your mail-in ballot super early, figure out how you track it and make sure it's been logged once it got to the election officials. Be a steward of your vote. And stay informed, and then share that information with those around you. I encourage you all to feel individually called to be a part of the solution here. Your vote, your active engagement, your critical thinking around the information, your holding your elected officials accountable is at the core of our functioning democracy, and of us turning the tide on what is happening in our nation. And to echo Josh's point, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a great model for how we can continue to hold folks accountable, but everything still comes back to you as an individual being actively engaged and being an active steward of information. So thanks for joining us.
Okay. Well, I would say this, that if you came to this session today thinking we were going to talk about, well, when are the tanks in the streets and how do we forcibly remove President Trump from the White House and what have you, I'm happy to answer those questions for you offline. I believe they share our contact information, but I've intentionally tried to keep this positive. And I'll tell you, it's because I still believe in our democracy. I still believe that America is better than that. And I don't want us to resort to that. And if we do, there's a recent op-ed, for instance, that suggested calling upon the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to remove the president. Oh my goodness, no. Even if he could, and I'm happy to debate that with somebody, but do we want to be the country that did that? I don't want us to be. There are so many things that we can do to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it starts with what we've talked about today, about education, get your vote out. Yes, you may have to wait 8 hours in line. Yes, you may have to, keep trying to track down your mail-in ballot. You may have to bring it in person. but we can do this. And if we do those things, then I hope that we never have to see those tanks in the street or the Secret Service escorting out the president. I don't want us to get to that, because I believe we don't need to if we all believe in each other and in ourselves.
Thank you all so much for giving of your time and your expertise. Thank you for the participants for staying with us and asking such great questions. I'm going to, without checking in with the panelists, offer that we'll scan through the ones we couldn't get to and try and give you some text answers. You all have our Twitter handles, and we are more than happy to engage on Twitter or further on questions that you have. But thank you for taking these issues seriously. Go to vote.org or the website of your choice to confirm your registration, request your absentee or mail-in ballot, and bug the crap out of your friends and families to go do the same. Thank you all so much.